So here we are again. This is Module 2, and this is about second language acquisition. So hello everybody. Hope everybody's feeling good. Let's go to our lecture. So my first question for you to reflect upon is, what is language proficiency? Many people define language proficiency in terms of the oral and written skills used in daily life. Do you agree with that? And then another question that I would have is, what's the difference between proficiency and fluency? And what's the difference between proficiency, fluency, and being bilingual? And on and on and on. We can keep going with this. So let's move forward. Here is the proficiency code for the U.S. State Department. At one point in my life, I wanted to be a U.S. State Department translator or a Foreign Service officer. And if you go to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, you will be tested according to these limits of proficiency. And if you do Peace Corps, I'm not sure if they do it today, but when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, this was the proficiency rating. It's a form of assessment. And this is a useful thing that you might want to use in terms of assessing your child or assessing the person that you've chosen for this course to monitor and observe and then try to gauge proficiency in that person. Here we go on to a really key concept. Again, I think I mentioned in a lecture earlier that Del Hymes is probably he's kind of like the #1 premier founder sociolinguist, and Del Hymes made this term called communicative competence, and it's defined by the ways that people understand not only the words, the vocabulary or lexicon, but the social conventions of using language, the pragmatics of using language. So communicative competence can be considered just as important as being able to translate words back and forth into a language, because you might use the wrong word, the right word, but in the wrong context, or the wrong word in the right context. For example, I have to tell you, I would be deeply offended if you wrote me an email and said, "Hey, yo there, baby," instead of "Hello, Dr. Sartor," because, the words are all right, but the context is wrong. So communicative context refers to the learner's ability to use language to communicate successfully. And successfully is divided into 4 areas by Cannell and Swain: the words and the rules, the register or the appropriate use of the language, from casual, colloquial, patois to formal, academic, scientific, or whatever, drawing room, courtroom, whatever. So the words and the rules, the appropriacy, the cohesion and coherence, how you put those words together to form a sentence or a phrase or a communication, and then the use, how you use communication strategies in general to get your point across. So let's take a look at this slide as well. Okay, so let's look at this slide. This is again repeating the 4 sub-concepts of what you need in order to have good communicative competence. And the words, the appropriacy, the cohesion and coherence, the use of strategies. The aim of communicative language teaching and the communicative approach, which is kind of trending, it's been trending for the last 30 years in the United States and abroad, is to teach communicative competence. That means not just teaching grammar translation or skills, but teaching people the social conventions of how to interact using another language. And this is something you have to think about in terms of teaching your children, because they may be coming from a completely different culture. Remember, we discussed names and how the use of names can vary across culture, and participant structures in terms of power and hierarchy and who gets to speak and when. So all of these conventions are part of communicative competence. And testing communicative competence is also very challenging, because the formats that teachers can use to evaluate their learners' competence include information, gap and role play activities for speaking, letter writing, note-taking, summarizing, and things that combine listening and writing competencies together. But you'd be surprised. You have to be very careful in assessing a child and understanding whether the comprehension is really there, because we as human beings are really, really good at mimicking things. So I hope you find this slide a little bit intriguing. I think it's interesting to think about how language conveys meaning. It's actually, to me, very surprising that we understand each other at all, because you know, there are so many miscues and mess-ups in words, and your complete vocabulary and semantic background is unique to you as an individual. And what you say depends on how you grew up from moment to moment to moment to the very time that you're here right now listening to this video. So the fact that we actually can discern from each other meaning in all kinds of forms, you know, emotional meaning as well as content meaning, is really kind of amazing. But back to this slide, the aspect, the word order, the intonation, and then the missing words all contribute to how maybe meaning is conveyed. And just for example, intonation, if I say to you, I like that, versus I like that, or I like it, you know, that intonation pattern has 3 different meanings on whatever it is. Another thing that I really like to Another thing that I really like is to look at the relationship between language and power, because they can't be divided from each other. There is an inherent relationship. If we think about rhetoric, rhetoric's about saying the right words at the right time in the right place and influencing people to agree with us or to do what we want them to do. And if we think about Hitler, he had the right words at the right time, and he shaped world events by that. So it can be a positive or a negative outcome. Language is a very powerful tool, and it can be used as a means of controlling or shaping the thoughts and beliefs of other people. One scholar at the University of Tasmania, Tongao Zhang, wrote that language is a weapon and a powerful tool in winning public support, especially during the current information revolution period. It's also a powerful weapon in the struggle of community against community and worldview against worldview. If you're interested in more about language and rhetoric and power, you could go to the World Wide Web and look at diplomacy.edu/language/rhetoric/language and power. And that's just kind of the politics of language. And we take a lot of that stuff just for granted, and as native speakers of English in our native countries. But think about the person who speaks with an accent. Think about that 55-year-old cab driver in Brooklyn, New York, who speaks with a thick Russian accent. He might have been a neuroscientist back in his home country, and he had to flee because he was Jewish or because something happened in terms of the political situation at home. So language is definitely connected to power. Another thing to think about when we think about language is the fact that every time the question of language surfaces, at least in this country, think about who's using the language and who is the dominant person in terms of that language. You know, right now, in our lifetimes, the language of the white male is the predominant language of English in the United States and Europe. English-speaking Europe. So there are a lot of things you can look at in terms of language and the relationships of how it is a controlling factor and a decisive factor in who gets the goods and services and who gets the respect and who gets the wealth. Another thing that I am actually personally interested in is the connection between language and identity. And this becomes even more interesting when people speak a multitude of languages, when they grow up bilingual from birth, or when they grow up multilingual from birth and schooling. Who are they? If you're a French speaker and an English speaker, are you French or are you bilingual, or are you Canadian? And what does your identity tell you about who you are when you choose to use certain languages? My contention is that language not only expresses identity, but it constructs our identity. And the interrelationships between language and identities are so closely interwoven that the words that we used are ideological, and they convey all kinds of meanings to the world around us. Language also conveys information, but it conveys more than just information. It shapes the information. It shapes and reflects our identity, and language determines how people see themselves and how they are seen by other people. If you're interested in that more, you might want to look at this scholar, B-A-K-H, Bakhtin, who's a very interesting thesis that we are constructed by, our identities are constructed by the words that came before us and the words we use with others and how others use words with us. It's all interconnected. It's kind of like game theory that Richard Nash constructed after World War II, the genius in A Beautiful Mind. Same kind of idea. Okay, this is just something a little cute for you in terms of identity crisis. You might want to watch a YouTube. Let me see if I can bring that YouTube up for you. Type it. Tap, tap, tap. It is youtube.com/watch?V equals capital F, capital P, little h, capital H, capital H, little t, capital N, 8, capital O, and 8. And it's also in your Brightspace. There are words that we use that are not English. Shampoo, sushi, all kinds of words. I think I put a list in Brightspace for you. And do we use words that do not translate into other languages? The one word that I know from birth almost that doesn't translate into other languages from Finnish is called sisu. And I just saw on the web that somebody is marketing a product using this word sisu. Sisu it is almost an indefinable translation. It means something like fighting to the death, never giving up, never caving in, but it means much more like it has a national Finnish identity associated with it as well. So it's a word that is only usually used in my lifetime until I saw it on the internet in a marketing scheme, only used by Finns, because only a Finn can have sisu. So there's some optional interesting stuff that you can look up in the PowerPoint. It's in the notes section if you want to look at the history of language. And if we go to the next slide, we can look at how English has changed over time. It's really interesting. I've said this many, many times in many, many lectures that 1066 was a key year because that's when the Normandy invasion came, and for the next 260 some years, people spoke French in England, not English, and there was a divide, a socioeconomic divide between those who spoke French, the aristocracy, and the peasants who continued to speak dialects of English. And that's why we have the word beef from the French boeuf, and the word cow from the English cow. So this again shows the power and the politics of language. But you might be interested in looking at how language has changed in English. If you're kind of a nerdy person like me in terms of linguistics, how the Norman invasion and the conquering of the English changed the way that even English words are said and spelled, like the great vowel shift, and how sound systems changed, and how words that used to be considered rude or vulgar are now popular, and how words that were considered normal, like the C word in Old English, was a perfectly reasonable word to use about females, and it is not a word that is acceptable in modern day English. And then how politically correct language has changed over time and transitioned. Another thing with the advent of technology that we should think about is the fact that the way that we use language has changed. I mean, we've become almost symbolic in terms of emojis. You know, this is kind of funny, but I mean, I don't know. I've used that emoji, I've used that emoji, I've used that emoji, and all the other ones, you know, like the newer emojis that you can use on the market. And we are conveying semiotic concepts, so we are using language in a different way today. Another thing to think of cell phones, smartphones especially, texting. We have a new grammar and a new syntax, and you can find all kinds of interesting ways to communicate using this text form of language. Please don't use that with me, but it's just showing how vibrant and creative language can be. Now, going back to our real idea is, how is language acquired? And in your book, you'll find from Light Brown and Spada especially, a great resource that can you use for review. And I think Dr. Zhang will use this in your courses, Second Language Theories, that you can look over. There are kinds of ideas for theories. There's the behaviorist, the innatist, the interactionist. There is also look over in your book about the difference. One of the things they say is that one of the first things that children, babies, learn is negating. And in English, there are 11 forms of negation. I wonder if you can tell me all those 11 forms to negate. But it's one of the interesting facts in terms of how languages are learned. There is a relationship to some degree between the first language learned and then the second language learned, and negation is one of the things we learn early on. So make sure you read your book chapter on this. Questions, how we learn to ask questions. In English, it's rising intonation pattern, as you can see there. Front loading and the do. And inversions. Be aware that any one of you who speak another language know that the way that we ask questions in other languages is not the same way that we ask questions in English. There are really diverse number of ways to ask questions, and also a word order and word structure and syntax and grammar. You know, if you don't speak another language, you sort of tend to take it for granted that, you know, if you ask a question, you just have the rising intonation, like, are you going to the park? Are you going to the park? And, you know, the intonation gives significance as well as it is a question marker. But that is not necessarily so, especially in languages that are tonal. Okay? So things here, the idea of defining bilingual. And if you want to watch some interesting stuff about bilinguals, some really funny stuff, it's in Brightspace for you. And in the PowerPoint itself, in the notes section, are some YouTubes that you can watch as well. And figurative language. As teachers, we have to be very careful of the language use that we choose. And we use figurative language that means other things in other languages. And so you have to be aware of that if you're teaching children or adults or people from other cultures, because, for example, a lemon in American English is not good. A bird in British English means a woman. We also use figurative language in terms of, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, or I told you 1,000,000 times to clean your room. We use figurative language in terms of metaphor. He has a heart of gold, or he has a heart of stone. You are my sunshine. The world is my oyster. You know, think about somebody coming from another language and culture. How would they possibly understand what that means? Idioms. Idioms are extremely difficult. So in the classroom, be aware that idioms don't translate straight across the board, and idioms are difficult to understand for people from other cultures. And in Brightspace, I have some stuff in there for you to look at idioms from other cultures to try to figure out what they mean. Another idea, irony and sarcasm, you know. I was hoping for a battle of wits, but you appear to be unarmed. I don't know how I would react if somebody said something like that to me, but if you are a second language learner, that might just go completely over your head. The book reviews CALPS versus BICS. This is a key concept. It will be on, no doubt, it would be on your TESOL endorsement test, your state test. So make sure that you know the difference and you know what those acronyms mean. Basic interpersonal communicative skills versus cognitive academic linguistic proficiency. And there is a video on Brightspace for you about BICS and CALPS, and I highly encourage you to Google it. And in relation to BICS and CALPS, you can see that the BICS is above the water and the CALPS is the underwater. So BICS is kind of like the superficial, conversational, chatty language that we all can pick up. And then the CALPS is explicit teaching of academic and content vocabulary. Okay. And what exactly is academic language? It's complex sentences and grammar, higher register vocabulary, specific content vocabulary. It has to be very explicitly taught. I have some videos for you to watch if you're interested. One of the other things is in terms of not just academic languages, but other kinds of content languages is military language. And then Deborah Tanner, who was at Georgetown University, she also did her life study ended up being the differences between male and female forms of communication, and she looked at all different aspects of that, including the language of the female and the language of the male. And this is one of the reasons we have men are from Mars and women are from Venus. My friend Bakhtin, and Bakhtin, you can see from that little quote, language is always connected to somebody else, and we are never alone in I mean, what's the point of language unless there's somebody to listen and interact with? And even if you're reading text, you are reading and interacting with the author, even if the author's been dead for hundreds of years, because this language is an interaction and it has an influence. And if it's a dead author, of course, the influence is one way, but we are influenced and impacted by language from the past, language from the present, and our language that we create today is impacting the way that language will be created tomorrow. It's funny, you know, the idea of time and space and language is a very kind of magical and mystical thing. And Bakhtin writes about this to great depth. So if you're interested in the esoteric ideas of language and time and interrelationships, he's your man. There are also many, many, many disappearing languages. When I was a graduate student, there were some, I worked with, my committee members were indigenous professors in New Mexico, and a Mexican American and an African American. And one of the things that we were all really concerned about was the disappearing languages. Around Santa Fe, where I lived at the time, and Albuquerque, where UNM, my school, was at, there were like 30 different Native American pueblos or towns, each with their own unique language. And a lot of those pueblos had less than, some of them had less than 20 speakers that were still native speakers of their indigenous languages. And some of them had a few hundred, and some of them, you know, it had less than 10. So languages are disappearing at an alarming rate today around the world, and it's because of the globalization, and it's because of the standardization and the fact of English as a global language and the 6 big languages of the United Nations. It's a kind of a scary thought, you know, because we thrive when there is creativity and diversity. I don't want to live in a homogeneous world where everybody speaks the same language, thinks the same way, does the same stuff. So English language learners have influence from their first language, And then there are English features that pose problems because they may not exist in their first language. There is a table on page 72, and you can refer to that. There are different factors that impact language learning, second language learning at school: the context, the primary language development, the age, other sociocultural, psychological factors, maybe trauma, the expectations of the teacher, and the teacher behavior. So I want to read these questions to you and ask you if you're doing what you feel about these questions that I'm going to read to you. So number one, if you're thinking about your students and your English language learners especially, do you know who I am? Number two, do you care about me? Number three, do you want me to succeed? Number four, do you realize that although my English is limited, I'm intellectually competent? Number five, do you understand my fear and my embarrassment that I must overcome in order to try to speak your language? And in the United States, what is the standard language? Well, we're in the Midwest, so white Midwestern English has been the standard language ever since I was born in 1957. It is the language of newscasts and broadcasts, CBS, NBC, CNN. That is the standard in the United States for English. It is not the standard in other parts of the world, or even in other parts of the United States. So this brings us to the end of this lecture, and I want you to think about maybe the one idea. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but a standard language or priority language is just a language with more guns and tanks. So see you next time.